Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that profiles the people behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world and inspiring future creators. And for all those that like really great stories, I'm Ira Pastor. I'm your health, aging, and longevity ambassador along for this journey. So here we are in 2019. We have surpassed $7 trillion in total healthcare expenditures around the globe. As part of that, we're spending close to about $1 trillion a year on pharmaceutical products. However, aside from the sheer size of these numbers, what is becoming equally, if not more fascinating, is the fact that we are seeing sort of the traditional pharma basket, which for most of the last century consisted of small organic molecule drugs or larger macro-molecular biologics, proteins, vaccines, things of this nature, really changing in front of us. We are now seeing pharma venture into some quite non-traditional areas, such as living organism therapeutics, micro-biome cocktails, electroceuticals, and digital therapeutics, which will be the topic that we're going to be focusing on today. So digital health is, broadly defined as the convergence of digital technology with healthcare to enhance efficiencies of healthcare delivery, make medicines more personalized and precise, involves the use of information and communication technologies, and ultimately can include, but is by no means limited to, applications of telemedicine, smart devices, remote monitoring. So for today's guest, I could think of really no one better to come on and talk with us for a while about this exciting, evolving area in the pharma space than Eugene Borukhovich, who is Global Head of Digital Health Incubation at Bayer and its unique new G4A venture initiative. Bayer, as many will be aware, is a German multinational pharma and life science company. 40 billion in revenue, 100,000+ employees, and is one of the largest drug companies in the world. Businesses including human and veterinary pharma, consumer health products, ag chem, seeds, and so forth. And the G4A venture initiative is defined as engaging with the brightest minds inside and outside of Bayer, while identifying emerging trends and needs at the intersection of humans and technology, and transforming into new products and solutions for people. Mr. Borukhovich has a background in management information systems, finance, and strategy from Rutgers University. He is also entrepreneur in residence at Personal Health Solutions Capital, and he serves as an advisor to literally dozens of digital health startups, which he enjoys mentoring, and he is also an avid blogger about innovation, digital health, and startup ecosystems. All that being said, Eugene, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure. And that sounded like a cocktail of things as well as you were describing what digital health is.
Well, thanks for that. To start out, we typically start out the show by, giving our guests the floor, basically learning about you, sort of your background, where you grew up, how you got interested in information technology, information systems, and ultimately sort of your journey to, here we are in 2019, and you are really at the top of this convergent epicenter of technology and health. Give us a little bit of that story.
So how long do we have?
As long as you want.
So geographically, born in the old Soviet Union, but specifically Odessa, Ukraine. My parents immigrated in the late 80s, and I grew up initially in New York City, and then right across the George Washington Bridge in New Jersey. So that's geography, but then my career actually took me and the family over to Amsterdam, where we spent 5 years. And when I started with Bayer, it's been about 3 years living in Germany. So I guess I would say a global citizen. Career-wise, so as you mentioned, I did go to Rutgers, both for undergrad and grad. So undergrad, I did management information systems, and while, of course, as you can imagine, that's technology, but actually applying the management and leadership on top of information systems, that was my degree. And then when I did my executive MBA program, I did it in finance and capped it off with strategy as an elective. in the EMBA program. Career-wise, it was actually kind of interesting because, to be fair, my first startup was with my roommate. I had a job at Kaplan Educational Centers where I was doing, desktop support, things like that. And one of the things they gave me is one of those old LC3 Macs
Mm-hmm.
that we put under my bed. I was doing the work, and very typical startup story back in those days. We started hacking away at a e-commerce business that was honestly just a bunch of junk that we were selling at a margin. Those were the old days of eBay where they were not still blocking, e-commerce play and redirection. So, ultimately it was about $1 million in revenue with some tiny margins. And then right around the dot bomb, we actually shut it down. We didn't take it anywhere. So that was an interesting experience, both from tech, but also growth hacking perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I moved on. Actually, I won't bore you with the whole career, but I spent some time entertainment industry, so Viacom, again in a more of an engineering implementation role, and the technology side. And then if I fast forward, jumped to another startup, which was called SciBuy, which was funded by Roland Back of Scotland, and that was an interactive TV e-commerce.
Mm-hmm.
Way too early for the days.
Mm-hmm.
And then, honestly, I almost stumbled, because the company reached out to me, was for Medco Health Solutions.
Okay.
And, now it's Express Scripts, but it's pharmacy benefit management. Having said that, living on this side of the pond, looking at the PBM industry as honestly almost a middleman, I sort of go back and think twice.
Right.
But at the time, it felt like I can now apply everything that I've learned and my technology skills and quote unquote growth hacking to probably the most or the best cause ever, is actually helping, save lives. Yes, it's a pharmacy benefit manager, it's distribution. And so I had about a 10-year career there. Aside from the job that they hired me for, the other 4, I sort of applied my growth hacking or I guess entrepreneurial DNA to
Mm-hmm.
really create those 4 positions for myself, seeing a white space. While I was there, I started Health 2.0, second chapter. So Health 2.0, for those who don't know, is a conference that just got bought out by HIMSS recently. And now I think 10 years ago, I had the first meetup there in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what really got me even more into the startup space. As a matter of fact, I joined a one-man garage show, Dan Kogan, in a startup called Health World Web. And about a year and a half later, we actually ended up selling the company. And that's when I roughly moved to Amsterdam for my CIO role at Medco.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of career-wise, and then I'll skip a few in there, but it's been about 3 years at Bayer now.
Okay. It's really refreshing to we have a lot of similarities in that I was at Rutgers too, I guess a few years before you, but also in the PBM industry. So I enjoy this journey because I ended up in big pharma at GlaxoSmithKline, and there's some we can talk offline about that, but it is
all right, sounds good.
a fascinating set of experiences that you had, and then to mold you into sort of what you're doing now. Before we get into sort of Bayer and G4A, I just want to sort of get your top line view on digital health today, and where you see it going. I consider myself sort of an outsider to this, but I see a very interesting dynamic that throughout my own career has existed over the years in different disciplines, where there's many different segments or companies from different segments I see maneuvering for their place at this digital health table. So, obviously separate from big pharma, you have, all these tech companies, Apple and Amazon and Google and so forth, that are all also making strategic moves into healthcare, into digital health with, the goal of using sort of their Silicon Valley honed skills and cash, of course, to try to disrupt healthcare in the same way. Sort of using your crystal ball and sort of looking, where we are today and looking out, where do you see this going? Do you think one side's going to win? Is it going to be a convergence of sort of these different
Yep.
capabilities? Love to have your take on this.
Sure. So first of all, I'll say who wins is us, the healthcare consumers and patients, right? Because I think for the first time ever, there's such a tremendous competition, and when there's competition, better solutions come, right? So with all these players really jumping into the game, I think ultimately we win, right? So that's kind of one quick comment. I've also been saying that when you look at the health and care ecosystem, and there's a reason I break that up. You have I'll say kind of wellness and fitness companies, I would call such as Fitbit and others, that have the direct access to the consumer, right? The wellness and health and care consumer. And you're starting seeing some propositions going more towards B2B into the existing healthcare system. You have hospitals, ACOs, et cetera, that are actually moving more into, there's some hospitals that are creating their own generic drugs. You have insurers that, yes, they're managing risk, but guess what? They're now investing, if you notice some of the latest investments into more primary care via telemedicine.
Right.
And so the way I'm kind of describing is that that whole health and care ecosystem is turning continuously on its head right now, because everybody's trying to figure out what that model will be, because we all know the current one doesn't work for us, the patients, right? So that's kind of overall my observations. Who wins? I honestly don't, aside from us, the patients. The way I describe it, and I get asked a lot by the executive management at Bayer, who are the competitors? What are they doing? And my comment is, I'm actually not looking at our other life sciences player as truly competitors in this space, because it's got all the same structures, the decision-making process, and it's actually the combination of, again, what I described the players earlier, the tech giants, the insurers. And in one summary statement, I'd say the organizations that quote unquote win are the ones that can reduce the learning cycle as quickly as possible. So the fastest learning organizations win. So the question to me becomes, you mentioned Silicon Valley, right? And the tech giants. In theory, those are the ones. And there's also criticism to a certain extent from the healthcare system, is that, the tech giants, they don't have the clinical skills. But I would argue they do have a lot of cash. And we've been seeing in the last 3 years or so, lots of moves, lots of hires in that space to actually bring that clinical knowledge together with the data science and a different way of working, but also knowing thy customer, the end customer. And so I think, that's kind of where I see it. I will not call who wins aside from us patients, because I think it's all up for grabs at the end of the day.
Sure. Absolutely. Completely agree with that. No, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Is sort of standing back, but now going in for the deeper dive, let's talk a little bit about Bayer and G4A. Can you give me some background on sort of this unique sort of what I sort of see as sort of a venture innovation model, almost like an internal sort of venture fund set up at Bayer, and then some of the things that obviously non-confidential. I've read about women's health and test for endometriosis and some oncology initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about some of the investments that you've made and which ones you're most excited about?
Yep. Yeah, so maybe I'll step back a little bit. When I came into Bayer, there was a number of what I would call bottoms-up teams in our organization called Business Services, which sits across the 3 divisions, and that's pharmaceutical, our consumer, and our crop division. And I won't go through all of them, but there was a digital health incubator that was being spun up. There was the Grants for Apps effort. which literally started as grants and literally for apps in 2013. There was a digital accelerator sitting somewhere in Leverkusen. And so it took some time, but we basically really got cracking, I would say, January of last year, after a number of reorganizations and pulling all these teams together. With, by the way, probably about 40% of the team was actually replaced, and brought in some fresh thinking.
Mhm.
And we united under the G4A just because I think grants for apps really, and this is thanks to Jesus Deval, who actually had the epiphany in 2012-ish to get this going. And that's when I met the team in 2013. And I loved what they were doing because at the time, most pharma companies were actually investing into other accelerators that were
Mhm.
being spun up. And I think if you think about Bayer, 120,000 person organization, where generally speaking, changing that mindset, how startups work and how large corporations work, was one of the key things for grants for apps. There was, of course, a component to public relations. We will not decline that.
Mhm.
There's great talent acquisition, and that's a bit of how the program started and placed itself in digital health. Once we and it kept pivoting year over year, right?
Mhm.
So last year, and I guess I'll just kind of pick up from there. We reorganized in really a couple of capabilities. So one is our kind of early stage program, combined with commercial programs. And I'll talk about what the pivot is for this year, 2019.
Mhm.
We've also expanded to our consumer business last year, because generally the G4A program really started with our pharma business. But a little bit of my premise and the team's premise is, digital health is not, the world doesn't care how Bayer is set up. It's not pharma, it's not consumer. It's a human-centric approach to health. So, again, we run these startup partnership programs, and we'll talk deeper into kind of why.
Mhm.
The second part of that is, or kind of sits in the middle, is our intelligence team. So part of that is we also have G4A family around the world. And this is what I would call almost like a franchise of G4A. So my team does not directly run it. It's very much bottoms up. And we want to get involved. How do we do it? And so we actually recommend to a lot of different countries, passionate Bayer individuals. It costs you almost nothing, but 50 beers on a topic. Just start a meetup locally, right? Get out of the office, drag people out, learn something new, and that's probably the easiest model. You could do an accelerator, you could do a commercial type of program, and then you can customize it for your market. So we actually don't, unlike other, I hate calling it global organizations, we're not actually prescribing anything, or governing anything. And that's actually what made it successful, because we now have accelerator running in Moscow, Istanbul, Seoul, Shanghai, Tokyo. We have a number of commercial type of programs running in another 6 or 7 countries, and the meetups are ongoing in 35 countries plus at this point.
Wow.
So I bring it back to the intelligence, and that's intelligence on, I would say, the ecosystems. Obviously, every country is different. The money flows are different. Even some things that you find out, for example, in China, prevalence for liver cancer is growing significantly, and you can only get that if you're yourself on the ground, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
of course, you can read it. So that's one part of the intelligence. The second part of the intelligence is to really understand how we can enhance and change the experience of health and moving people more towards preventative. So what are the key value pools that we can tap into to solve those challenges for the unmet needs? So that's the Intel team. And then the third part, which we just kicked off last year, is G4A Ventures. And one thing I want to correct you, we actually do not have a venture fund that invests in digital health. Ventures is venture creation,
Okay.
and it's anchored into behavioral science. To give your listeners a little bit of the preview, at the end of the day, it starts with a problem statement, and then the team, very startup style, and very different profiles than what I would say the rest of the organization, is growth hacking, right? And for the first 12 weeks is really understanding the problem, and ideating around that problem. It's ethnographic research. It's understanding the behavior. So to give you some, I'll say non-concrete examples, because unfortunately at this point I cannot talk about this venture that we will be taking to market in the next 12 to 18 months. But the process is very much, just because you do ethnographic research and you ask questions, actually observing people in their real world is much more effective. And actually on the startup side, those are the startups that succeed, that really understand the unmet need, the behavioral science behind it. And we in the team call it thick data. It's not the big data, it's thick data.
Yeah, okay.
So that's kind of the really three type of capabilities. Again, I'll just summarize. It's the intelligence gathering around the world, but also making concrete proposals on where are the unmet needs, also anchored in behavioral science, and we learned that from our ventures. Second one is our partnerships, which I can talk much deeper about on this one. And then the ventures is the new revenue stream, new business creation.
Okay. It's fascinating hearing this. What in essence, is a lot of startup lingo happening in such a sort of a large, multinational, centuries old conglomerate. It's very refreshing at the same time. It's completely fascinating, and the breadth of it, the number of countries that you have involved. It's just
and I want to point out one thing. My team, first of all, we basically almost run like a startup ourselves. I would give a hint because it varies widely, what Series A means between Europe and US.
Sure.
We basically run like a Series A startup ourselves. That's kind of our funding model. So just to give you, the breadth of activities that we're doing with what I would say still a relatively limited capital, but that's scarcity breeds creativity,
Sure.
and I think that's what makes it actually so much fun with the team.
I can imagine. I can imagine. I watched several of your presentations from recent years, and something else that you have lectured on, talked a lot about, has been artificial intelligence and deep learning, and sort of the applications of these newer technologies, which into the pharma health space. Could you just give once again sort of your top line on this space, and what's real, what's hype, where you see real, let's say, applications of artificial intelligence making impacts in sort of the digital ecosystem process?
No, absolutely. And this is a friend of mine who by the way, should have on the show as well, Milind. He just recently left Sanofi, probably about 2 years ago. And if you listen to some of it, I've been actually referencing him because the post that he made on Facebook clarified things for me personally. Just it was honestly eye-opening. And he asked a very simple question: quick, make a decision, do things better or do better things. Right. And the reality is any large corporation actually needs both, because you have the core business today that the goal is to bring new products to save people's lives as quickly, as efficiently as possible. Right. And so that laser focus on doing things better in your existing business is important. So I'll touch on that first as it relates to AI. I think, certainly, every industry and I'd say every new technology needs a buzzword. If you break that down, AI, there's applicability, A, along the value chain, B, even within the subset of technologies. So, and I'm not a researcher, just a little CYA. But if I look at the R&D, so just the R&D components themselves, and everything from identifying proteins to how the targets fit to the clinical trial and development, every piece of that can leverage technology along that path. right?
Right.
Now, there is now over 155 companies, if I'm not mistaken, the latest counts, that are only focusing on AI and drug discovery.
Right.
In drug discovery alone, you can break that up into further pieces, right? So I think the key and important thing is for everything from leadership to executives to honestly anybody is to really try to understand what can be applied where. And even these 153 companies can be bucketed along the value chain within the drug discovery, right?
Right.
So making sense of the signals from the noise, and the only way you can do that is engaged, involved, and test, right? And to give you an example, last year we took a pretty mature company called Cyclica. We ended up doing some significant testing with them. I won't talk about the results just yet, but this was something, just a quick example. We had another graduate, a G4A alumni called Turbine, that is applying AI in oncology and compound therapy development.
Okay.
And they're working continuously with our bioinformaticians and in drug development, right, throughout. So that's kind of there. If you keep moving along that value chain, there are use cases everywhere from medical affairs and coding. But I think, if you look at AI, I think some of the low-hanging fruit, and we've actually seen FDA, step in there, is in imaging, right? Because I
Right.
think imaging is probably, again, I'm not oversimplifying it, but it's probably the lowest hanging fruit in identifying diseases. So a company called IDX got an FDA approval just for the algorithm itself, which is astounding, right?
Right.
So that's in kind of the core, I'll call it core business optimization, and this is specific to pharma, but you can apply the same principles for insurers, same principles across the healthcare ecosystem. On doing things better, honestly, I think it's TBD, right? Everybody is looking at what are the new business models, and you can ideate around, well, health coaching is important, and we can automate health coaching, and it's a bot responding to you. I've tried probably a dozen of them, and while the technology is getting much better, I still know I'm talking to a bot, right?
Right. Right.
And in some cases it's great, in some cases it's not. It depends on the disease. Sometimes in mental health, you might not want to actually talk to a real person and you want to just bounce things off, but in other cases you may want to. So I think the opportunities on doing things better around new models of engagement is TBD, but there's certainly a lot of low-hanging fruit in the existing value chains where these technologies can be applied.
Wonderful. What is I know this might be slightly down the road, but I just one other area I just like your opinion on. I'm a former GSK person, and a couple of years ago they put this substantially large investment into what they call electroceuticals, sort of the goal of getting the drug out of the way entirely, and that the future vision for not everything, of course, but for certain applications is not going to be this pill or this protein or whatever, but it's going to be this, for lack of a better word, zap of information. On the simpler front, we see these video game sort of therapeutics that are beginning to knock on FDA's door on potentially improving Alzheimer's or other types of indications. What are your thoughts on sort of the therapeutic end of digital health? Do you see some of this more futuristic stuff connecting in with what you guys are doing to sort of have a entirely information-based information-ceuticals, I've heard it called, at some point in the future?
Yeah, you could argue, and of course the definition is kind of continuously moving. But if the digital health space you described earlier, again, in my mind, it's a bit of a buzzword, and I think it'll just become health in a digital world. But however, I think one of the shining lights, and I've said this before as well, is the digital therapeutics. We, as Bayer, actually were the first life sciences company to join the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, which was formed by the players like, Amada, Voluntis, Akili, which you mentioned, Game, right? And part of that is actually that those companies have been able to make way and define what digital therapeutics is today, right? And of course that will be challenged along the way. But in short, you still need evidence. It still needs to be clinically validated,
Right.
And it has to focus on some kind of behavior modification, and ideally reimbursable, right? Because we, fortunately, unfortunately, us as healthcare consumers, even though we still pay for it in taxes one way or the other, depending on which country you're at, still, cash out is tough.
Sure.
So that's, and I'm getting to the electroceuticals because it's also a software solution, meaning digital therapeutics.
Right.
And one would argue that electroceuticals may or may not fall under the DTX umbrella. There is a lot of software. Indeed, there's the, as you called it, ZAP.
Right.
That's the hardware part. Interestingly enough, last year we took into our accelerator a company called Kinaptic that actually has an electroceutical and a virtual reality headset. And some of the hypothesis, as you know, Bayer is very strong in cardiovascular, in preventing stroke,
Right.
in treating DVT. And so some of the use cases we're exploring, and that's actually one of the, out of the 6 companies last year in our accelerator, 3 of them got some commercial deals with us after that, or even during. And Kinaptic was one of them to really explore some use cases. So imagine, and by the way, I tried it myself a few times, and since this is video, which is great, there's a sleeve that goes on your arm.
Okay.
Basically, if you're, God forbid, you had a stroke, and I am going to show it, right? If your hand is like this,
Right.
when you're wearing that, and to use your term, it zaps you, you cannot not do this, right? It's automatic.
Right.
Stroke patients, as some of the listeners know, there's a lot of physical therapy and recovery. The other aspect and hypothesis is, as you're doing this, and in the virtual reality set, it's almost like your brain muscle memory, that if you're doing this continuously, the hypothesis is, and of course this is where it needs to be clinically validated, that maybe it can improve the physical therapy and recovery of stroke patients much quicker and potentially at a much lower cost.
Sure.
Right? So the question becomes, is it something that Bayer, because we play in preventing stroke, but can we help the patients recover in stroke and together go to market with Kinaptic? And this is just one of the many hypotheses. So I think, specifically in electroceuticals, I know it's been a very very hot topic. I think the true science and clinical validation and reimbursement is still out to be seen.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate that feedback, and it's nice to see that you are also looking at these opportunities. I was just when I saw the number that GSK put into it, at 750 million, I was like, whoa, this is not sprinkling a few dollars around. This is
that's quite a lot. Yeah, we certainly the structure for our what's called now growth track in our G4A is last year was just a 50K convertible note that's startup friendly, venture fund friendly. This year it could be between 50 to 100K. So, and then of course a commercial contract after that with Kinaptic specifically, but it's nowhere near the numbers that you just described for GSK.
Yeah, but nonetheless, I mean that's how the venture ecosystem works. So it's good to see that you're moving on these fronts. Eugene, I'm going to typically as we wrap up this show, and it's been extremely eye-opening. We typically move to sort of back to you. Were there any sort of along your path to get to where you are today? Any important mentors, influencers that have guided you along this path that if if they weren't there, that you would have said, I'm not doing this. I'm going to go into smartphones or something entirely different, where the people that guided you and said, hey, stay with this, and
Yeah, I mean, honestly, everybody around. There's certainly some people that I can call out, but it's the way I describe it to startups. Also, when I get asked what's the sauce for success, and I kind of have the 5 Ps, and all of them are persistence, 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 persistence. And
Right.
part of that is actually even the negative experiences. You actually learn a lot from them. So as an example, when I went over to Amsterdam for Metco, which was a joint venture with Silesia on this side of the pond, outside of the non-disclosure, I can talk about it was a good lesson learned of how not to do joint ventures. But I learned a lot, right? And with that, it's sort of, you meet the entrepreneur community around it, because it was yes, we're part of the big gorilla, but certainly very, very different style of working even there.
Gotcha. And now moving entirely, finally, the wrap-up question, and this is entirely away from science and totally science fiction, but we throw this at our guests. If you had the ability to travel in my hypothetical time machine over here to any place that you would want to go and meet somebody from the past, scientist, artist, some celebrity of some type, who would that be for you? And ultimately, what would you want to talk to that person about? You can take your time with that one if you.
It's probably a cliche one, but Steve Jobs. I honestly think, I think it's as you're sort of growing as a leader, to create new experiences for people is just amazing, and I think he was the master in that.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting. You're the first Steve Jobs person we had. We had a lot of Tesla.
Really? Okay, I'm surprised.
but no, completely understood, and it makes all sorts of sense. It's been really such a pleasure having you spend the time with us. You really opened our eyes to really an entirely, it seems like an entirely new industry that is really going to be forming, and you were really in the middle of it. Anything about 2019 moving forward? Anything that else you want to talk about? I'd love to have you wrap up.
Just not to keep your listeners, but as I mentioned earlier, we as a team continuously pivoting, and so one thing what happened with our G4A partnerships or programs last year, we had Accelerator, Dealmaker, Generator. It got very confusing for the startups and the community.
Mm-hmm.
So we've completely redesigned the process this year, where it's really just one way in, and startups can choose from growth track, which is more of a typical accelerator model, but we do require an MVP. We require a full cross-expertise team with that, and ideally either filed patents and early peer-reviewed clinical validation. The market has matured tremendously,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's one track, that's growth track, and then advanced track, we're very transparent about number of different challenges out there. We have about 20 listed, from women's health to cardiovascular. And the goal for the advanced track are these kind of Series A to Series C plus mature companies that have a product that we can co-create a solution together. So that's the applications are running now through end of May, and we did make it much more complex for the startups to apply, because we're really trying to weed out or find signals from the noise. And what we're seeing is very, very much quality of application. So if there's any listeners that know interesting and great companies that can solve challenges with us, just head over to g4a.health.
Absolutely, and we'll link to all this as the blog and the video and the radio networks all propagate. So hopefully you'll get a lot of
Excellent.
a lot more people coming to the table and coming to Bayer, because I don't it was eye-opening to me to realize that a company like yours is so active in this space and truly fascinating. Really look forward to watching moving forward. For everyone listening, it's been Eugene Borukhovich, Global Head of Digital Health Incubation at Bayer, and its unique G4A initiative, doing really amazing things in the digital health space. Everyone keep an eye on it, and hopefully see more fascinating things, and have you back in the future as these clinical translated opportunities get to market. So once again, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.